So we have the violent disorder at Supermax and Ray Colopy amongst those later tried and sentenced. Some success for the Gardaí to take those people off the streets, but it continues. And in July you have John Ryan shot dead. Now he's another brother?
Yeah, that's Eddie's brother.
Eddie's brother, yeah.
And, he was working on the patio. At the time, I think it was two guys turned up and shot him. I think that... I don't think it was ever solved. Like this particular case, there was suspects nominated, as they say. That was the King Colopys hitting back in this case. And then in between that, or just after that, then you have an unusual one that you have Kelly of Kilrush is shot through his window in his house in Kilrush. And we know now that the suspect for that was a guy called John Kramer, which is worth talking about him because he blamed Kelly of Kilrush for John Dundon shooting him with a submachine gun in Limerick, where he suffered, something like 16 bullet wounds, and it was over the proceeds of a jewellery robbery. And Kramer was one of these kind of, I suppose, again, a career criminal, a professional career criminal, who ultimately would die from his drug addiction in a hotel room in Limerick, and spent a bit of time in prison in the high security in Portlaoise. But wasn't really aligned to any group. And he was a notoriously tough character as well. I remember being told a story about him where one of the bullets had kind of moved. It had kind of was now starting to protrude from his chest, from under the skin. And he'd asked the prison authorities, could he keep it as a souvenir? And they said, no, you can't. We can't allow you to do this. And when the doctor in the A&E took it out anyway, eventually he had to go across the road to Portlaoise General Hospital. As soon as the doctor took it out and showed him, says, we got it, he grabbed it off him and swallowed it. So he was determined to get his souvenir. Yeah. But I suppose it's a kind of a side thing, but it kind of shows you the level of, I don't know,
but the violence comes, some of these guys, violence comes to Kelly of Kilrush's door, who has sort of sat in the background supplying and, laundering and agitating this feud in a way. But he survives.
Yeah, he was shot in the chest. He was lucky to survive, but he does survive.
Yeah.
And we know we'll find out later as this goes on that he continues to be involved in what's going on in Limerick. So I mean, in October then that year, Kenneth Dundon, who is the father of the Dundon sons, he stabs his wife's lover to death in London. He put a screwdriver through the man's cheekbone and killed him in a jealous rage because he felt that this guy was stealing his wife Anne away from him. And so again, it shows you the level of violence. This is the dad of the Dundon brothers, who have already kind of forged their reputation in Limerick, as well as the UK as well, of course.
He ultimately gets a conviction for manslaughter.
He does, yeah. And he got a kind of a 6 or 9 year sentence or something like that, So
he goes in, does his time.
Because there wasn't necessarily intent that he went to kill him. I don't know, putting a screwdriver through someone's face, I would have thought would suffice his intent, but obviously not. So, I mean, the next person to die then is Michael Campbell McNamara. He would have been, the theory was that he would have been part of the Keane gang, and he was found in a field. There was evidence he'd been tied up and he'd been stabbed repeatedly, shot in the face, that he'd been tortured, and that there was an attempt made by him to lure again one of the Colopys to come out and meet him or something like that. But I think it was Brian Colopy was the focus of that, but he had the spider sense to know that the McCarthy Dundons were possibly up to their old tricks again and didn't stir.
And is this opportunist, the murder of Michael Campbell McNamara, is he literally, they've got him, basically, they've captured him, that sort of, they're kind of like clocking up bodies at this point, the two sides?
Yeah, I mean, it is like it's tit for tat, and they're making it very clear that they're trying to kill, they're trying to decapitate the other gang. Like, they're not just happy getting the soldiers, they want to kill the bosses.
So by December of that year, 2003, big success, I suppose, for the Gardaí, who have been investigating the murder of Ciarán Keane and the stabbing of Owen Tracy, who gives evidence, I think, at these trials. So they've arrested and charged Desi Dundon, Smokey Costello, James McCarthy, Anthony Noddy McCarthy and David Frog Eyes Stanners in relation to that double cross. They're the guys on the road who transported them and who basically killed them, certainly Keane, and attempted to kill Tracy. what sort of evidence did he give? Did you cover this trial?
I didn't cover it. I think I can't quite remember.
It's hard to remember.
I might have been in
December
for
2003.
at different times. As for some of these trials that we'll be talking about, I was definitely in some of them for a day or two. But no, Owen Tracy was the star witness. He was the main witness. He clearly identified the people who were involved in luring him to the meeting, the people who tied him up, and he claims he saw who killed his uncle Kieran Keane. And that all went before the court, and it was believed. And of course, there was repercussions in this as well, because you know, while this is going on, you've John Dundon in the back of the court making audible threats to Sophie Keane, the widow of Kieran Keane, and also to Owen Tracy. And
is there a jury at this, or is this?
No, it is a jury trial, at this stage. And this is the trial that had to be moved out of Limerick to Dublin, just for the safety of the jury. I mean, again, it was seen, I suppose, to some extent, that was it was a bit of, I suppose, a failure of the state that they couldn't hold in Limerick. But then again, I wouldn't necessarily look at it that way. I mean, Limerick is a small town in comparison to Dublin. It'd be very unfair to ask people who, you know,
could pass these guys or relatives of them in the supermarket.
Yeah, and, you know, who are known for holding grudges for a long, long time. So, I mean, it's not like they'd forget about you after 6 months or a year. You know, it was never going to work where you could have, I suppose, a trial like this, like in a town.
I mean, it's hard to think of a trial like that nowadays outside the Special Criminal Court, isn't it? I mean, we get so used to these gangland trials being held in the Special Criminal Court. There's reasons, you know, for it being,
and this is one of the key reasons for it.
This is one of the key reasons.
Yeah.
So all 5 of those are jailed for life. The first Dundon really to be put away in prison for life. But still, we enter into 2004, and, you know, the violence and the unrest continues.
Yeah, I mean, it's nonstop. It was around this time, I remember I actually ended up speaking to Christina Ryan, who would have been John Ryan's widow.
Right.
And there was kind of, I think there was a book out by a local journalist at the time, and I think the family were unhappy about how they'd been depicted, and she was insistent that, you know, John Ryan had nothing to do with criminality, and that her own family, which was the McCarthys, originally from the Island Field, who would have been, in their eyes, they're very much the victims of the Collopys. They wanted to put their side across, but they were also talking about kind of the intimidation that, you know, she had faced. Like, you know, she had members of the Collopy family, like the men, sort of attacking her when she was on the street. She was constantly being told that her husband's body would be dug up and left on her doorstep, and there was graffiti in the city to that effect at the time. So you had, you know, this kind of really nasty level of intimidation going on.
Where'd you go to meet her?
I met them in a house. I was actually very close to the rugby ground, Thomond Park. I think it was one of the relatives' homes or whatever. They had long. I think the mother basically abandoned the house in the Island Field. Had been burnt down, and I do remember them talking about how, you know, it basically broke the mother. That she couldn't stay in the house she had lived for so long, and it was, you know, deeply traumatic for them. And one of the guys that was with her when I was talking to her, Patrick McCarthy, is one of the guys that would have been shot at by the Ryan Tracys in the Island Field at the time, and he spoke about the back window was smashed and there was a child in the car at the time, and, you know, that he suffered an injury. And again, this is a case, you know, it was a case that wasn't successfully prosecuted again because of, I suppose, the intimidation that would surround these cases as well.
And how did you find them? Like, I mean, you're sitting in the kitchen having a cup of tea with these people who are right at the heart of this incredible, frightening, terrifying feud. They're carrying on, they're living.
Yeah, they are. Yeah, she was actually, when I was talking to her, like she was wearing the uniform of a well-known company. Like she had a job, you know, was, you know, had obviously taken time off, like, you know, because they were, I don't know who was necessarily behind, like whose great idea it was to ring up the Sunday World and talk to them, but they had various documents, and they had, like they had 2 brothers that were killed by Anthony Kelly not of Kilrush, but Anthony Kelly from Limerick, whose brother Mikey Kelly was, you know, would at one point was an alderman in the city, and he stabbed to death 2 of her brothers. And again, this was the early 80s, and they were saying, look, this idea that their brothers were involved, trying to kill someone was untrue. They were trying to say that Kelly had come to the pub fully armed up and had carried out this, and it was murder. He was convicted of manslaughter, or acquitted of manslaughter. I can't remember, but he was, Mikey Kelly at the time, he kind of created a peace deal, which was kind of very much seen as trying to get his brother, off charges, really, rather than actually, not particularly caring about whether there was any long-lasting peace. But it was
and were the Kellys totally separate? Because I do remember Mikey Kelly speaking to him. Were they totally separate entity?
Mikey and Anthony are brothers.
Yeah.
And they had a security company, Kennedy Security, and the legend was that they didn't actually have to employ anyone. They just put the sign up protected by Kennedy or by Kelly Security, and no one would go near the building site or the building or whatever. But I think he was one of these characters. It's probably too nice a term to use. He's one of these people who kind of like to kind of try and outsmart the authorities, or to be seen outsmarting the authorities. He's kind of like James, or not James, but Martin, the General Cahill, like to poke fun at Establishment Ireland as a criminal. But we're digressing a bit, I think, into the Kellys. They're kind of a separate...
I know they're a separate entity. That's what I was just saying. 2004, also significant. Brian and Vincent Colopy make a failed attempt to shoot Wayne Dundon at McDonald's.
Yeah, again, this is something I don't remember this at the time, but this came up in a recent cab case again. It was Ray Colopy's cab case. And they're talking, and they're going through the kind of, I suppose, the guard intelligence to give the belief evidence. And they're talking about this one where, a motorcycle and his passenger turned up and a couple of rounds were fired at Wayne Dundon, I think, as he was queuing to get his burger and chips, and was, again, lucky to escape. And the guards actually managed to arrest 4 people shortly afterwards. But again, a prosecution never happened, for whatever reasons. Obviously, the evidence wasn't there.
And while we didn't know that at the time, I mean, again, there's a huge attempt to take off the head of a snake, and that comes with repercussions. You don't make attempts on the lives of any of these gang bosses without them realising they have to take out the opposition. So it sort of just deepens the whole murderous feud, doesn't it? At the same time, we'll bring back in James Martin Cahill, because he's being sentenced to 5 years in the Special Criminal Court at this stage for those weapons offences. But as you said earlier, you alluded to that he was beginning to get a very paranoid, and he was sort of suffering from a little bit of mental health from being in prison.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. So in May that year, in 2005, he basically approaches the guards or writes to them wherever he makes contact, and goes on to make a statement and puts 100 names in it, apparently, and it's all set there. He's all set to be the new star witness in the Brian Fitzgerald murder. He admits he was the gunman.
He names Gary Campion.
And he names Gary Campion as the getaway driver. And he names the likes of Desi Dundon and John Dundon and Kelly O'Kilrush as being the people who showed him how to use a gun and told him what they wanted done.
And hired him, basically.
And basically hired him and promised him 10 grand to carry it out. So this is kind of seen as a huge breakthrough, and it was kind of needed, because I think the guards realised that Philip Dean, the intimidation has got to him, that his family, his wife and children in the UK are effectively hostages of the McCarthy Dundon gang where they live, that they've no way out, even though he was in the witness protection programme. And I think the UK authorities had reacted as well and had them under protection, but realised that, it was never going to be safe for him to continue down that road. So they lost him as a potential witness. And then James Martin Cahill comes in, and suddenly is ready to talk, because he feels that the Dundons are out to kill him. And again, as I said, he probably wasn't wrong.
He probably wasn't wrong. At this point, you have Desi Dundon already jailed for life, but the big name there, and the next one that possibly could be taken off the streets with this evidence, is John Dundon, a second brother. You've really got Desi, John and Wayne as the key figures in that family. And
Wayne actually at this time now, so say December 24 going into 2005. So in December of 2004, Annabelle Dundon, who was 14 at the time, is refused entry to a pub owned by Roy Collins and his stepson.
She's the only daughter of the family.
She's the only daughter, and the barman who ends up being spoken to by Wayne Dundon, Ryan Lee, he's then shot in the leg by a man wearing a motorcycle helmet, who reappears half an hour after Wayne Dundon has stormed off staring, at Lee Ryan. And he's shot in the leg. And then he goes to go out one door, the gunman, and then realizes he has to go back out the way he came and shoots him again, this time in the pelvic area. So lucky he didn't kill him.
So you have the Dundons. It's the second time they've kind of come up against the business people of Limerick, because they've initially taken out and murdered Brian Fitzgerald, who tells them, "You're not coming in here to do your drugs." And now their younger sister, I mean, this seems to be such a petty thing. She's refused entry because she's 14, and the legal age, obviously, to be drinking or in pubs is 18. And so he, basically, Dundon comes back and, he shows something there, doesn't he? A lack of control, a lack of... he's very reactive. Temper is going to go against him.
The impulse to kind of immediately punish any slights to his reputation or loss of face is kind of immediately punishable in his eyes. So, I mean, you consider that, Brian Fitzgerald is shot dead because he barred them. And then, Lee Ryan is lucky to escape because of his, he barred him.
Yes.
And so, I mean, something relatively petty.
Relatively petty,
exactly.
It's got
nothing to do with the drugs business.
And is Wayne Dundon pretty quickly caught? He's pretty quickly arrested and put on trial for the Ryan Lee shooting.
Yeah, so like in May 25, around the same time, James Cahill is telling the guards he wants to talk.
Yeah.
The Wayne Dundon goes on trial then for the threats to Ryan Lee, and that works out in favour of the guards, I suppose, or the judiciary or society, whichever one looking, and he gets 5.5 years for that. So you have Wayne Dundon is now off the streets as well. So you have Wayne Dundon, Christy Keane are all in prison.
Desi Dundon and
Desi
the others.
Desi Dundon is off. I mean, the same year, like all of the killers of Kieran Keane, they all lose their appeal as well in October that year. So that looks like it's ramping up. It looks like kind of the authorities are getting on top of things. But in October, David Noonan is shot dead in Partine in Clare. That's a murder where we're not really sure what happened. It's featured on Crime Call, relatively recently. I know family members still bring it up on the anniversary, looking for information what happened. He had been in prison, hadn't been long out, and was basically, the theory is that he was lured to a meeting and he met his death there. And it's not clear exactly why.
It's not clear which side or who or...
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
And it's all that kind of... It's just that murkiness, because no more than the Hutch and Kinahan feud, there are overlaps of gangs. It's sometimes it is a civil war among some of these guys, or it's just, again, I mean, it could be a simple matter of somebody getting blamed for something they didn't do, and it could be a simple matter of somebody lost a stash of drugs and they don't want to be seen to be losing face. And we know, we've seen it in other gangland feuds. It's all about some people want to be seen as the hard man, and if there's a kind of a victim that they can kill where they know there won't be repercussions, they'll do it just to gain a reputation that they're a killer, and that they're willing to go to the highest extremes, and that will somehow push them up the ladder of the criminal underworld.
Now, in the meantime, and just before we get on again to James Martin Cahill and his conviction, but Red Larry McCarthy gets 11 years in the UK. Now, who's Red Larry McCarthy?
Red Larry, now, if you remember, we started off with the threats to Brian Fitzgerald.
Yes.
It's the same Red Larry McCarthy.
Yes.
He's first cousin of Wayne and John and Desi. And he's seen as the leader of the McCarthy Dundons at this stage. Like, he's
the brains or the broad?
He's both. Like, and he's the guy who is dealing directly with Chaser O'Brien, who at around this time is in Belgium and is caught by the Belgian authorities involved in gangland activity, and gets a 2-year sentence. And a part of that kind of investigation into Chaser O'Brien's international drugs operation, Larry McCarthy is picked up in effectively a weapons supermarket in London.
Right.
And he gets an 11-year sentence for that. So they've now added another very senior figure of the gangland people who are now behind bars. So again, you're kind of wondering, like, how does the feud keep going with so many top, leading members?
Exactly, behind bars. In November, Darren Coughlin is beaten and kicked to death.
This is, again, this is a case of mistaken identity. There's a group of fellas in a car, they see him. So you have Richard Tracy, who's a brother of Owen Tracy, Joe Keane, the son of Kieran Keane, who's been murdered. They're among a group of other people, and they're sentenced to 6 and 7 years for this. And it is very much, Darren Coughlin had nothing to do with the feud. I think he was an apprentice of some kind. He had nothing to do with it, an innocent guy. And basically he was beaten and kicked, and he died a couple of days later, I think, in hospital is the way it worked out. And it was Judge Paul Carney. It was the same judge who was involved in the Kieran Keane murder trial, where the 5 men, were sentenced, and he more or less said, you're going to stay in jail until this feud is over. And in this case, he warned the families that he reminded them that they would die in prison if there wasn't an end to this feud. And he said, as far as he could see, no heed had been paid to this warning, that you had this kind of, again, opportunist, random attack, and it was the wrong guy.
Mm-hmm. So you've mopped up a few more key characters, sort of, relatives of some of the key players there. And again, they're behind bars, which I'm sure is becoming a little bit fraught in behind bars as well, because we do sometimes forget about the prison system. They have to keep them apart. They have to make sure that nothing goes off within prison, because they're perfectly capable, as Judge Paul Carney said, of really conducting this feud wherever they are. By the end of that year, we have, first of all, in November, Cahill is convicted of the Brian Fitzgerald murder of his own.
He more or less pleaded guilty. Yeah. And he talks about he wanted to get off his chest and this.
Does he give evidence eventually, or have I jumped
when
ahead?
the others are charged?
Okay, right. We'll wait.
Not in his own one. You're jumping ahead.
I'm jumping ahead. So we have to keep going on our timeline, which is always the best way to tell these complex stories. But meanwhile, you have Wayne Dundon in prison. You have Desi Dundon in prison, and John Dundon is eventually jailed that year in 2005 for 4.5 years. He pleads guilty to threatening to kill Owen Tracy. He's still looking to kill him, or that was during that murder trial.
That was during the murder trial.
When he was giving, so it's intimidation here now of a witness.
Yeah, so this is kind of nearly 2 years after the trial, even after the appeal has failed. And then his trial goes ahead, so he's now inside as well. So you now 3 of the Dundon brothers. The only one who's not in prison involved in crime is Ger Dundon at this stage.
Yeah.
So don't forget, he's still only, 19, I think?
Yeah, he's the youngest,
he's the youngest of them. Yeah.
And the father is in jail, or certainly coming to the end of his sentence in the UK for killing the mother's boyfriend. Is Owen Tracy giving evidence in the John Dundon in this charge with he pleads guilty, so there is no trial. Dundon ultimately pleads guilty. That's probably why he gets the 4.5 years. But was Tracy going to have to give evidence if that went to trial again?
It was audible. Like, the guards heard it. Everybody heard it.
Okay.
Like, there was, well, maybe not everybody, but a lot of people heard it.
He did it in the courtroom?
He did it at the back of the courtroom. Like,
I'm going to kill you.
Yeah.
Yeah. Right.
It wasn't subtle.
Now, 2006, and that leads back to something that happened there in November 2005. So you tell that.
Yeah, so this is kind of just to give it's a bit of an insight that we're talking about the intimidation that was going on. So in February, there's a couple of trials of the people who had originally made statements, who witnessed the murder of Eric Leamy. And they originally had told the guards.
Where's Eric Leamy killed now?
Eric Leamy
yeah,
was stabbed to death in 2001,
right.
I think. And Liam Keane was charged with that.
Yes, and he got off that, yes.
And he got off that, and that was the famous, again, as I mentioned, the picture, like handcuffed and giving the 2 fingers to the cameraman. But there's one woman who had initially ID'd him as being the killer, and she more or less had withdrawn her statement or told the court that she didn't know who did it, or she was mistaken. But it was heard in that case then, her father gave evidence in her case where she was charged with perjury, that Kieran Keane had phoned to make sure you say nothing. So, I mean, you have a senior gang figure who is, ultimately you're going to be killed himself, is threatening, basically a neighbour, I
can't believe they charged her with perjury.
She wasn't the only one, and there was others as well.
Given a statement, but she was too afraid to go to court.
No, some people know. Some they went to court, and then gave evidence that no, that was wrong. That I didn't make that statement. I don't know who did it. That was the kind of the over. There was a number of witnesses, and again, this is what the judge at the time called a case of collective amnesia. Again, I think it was Judge Carney as well in that one as well. So, but you had that year then, you kind of 2006, 2007 is probably in terms of the intensity of the murders, like it's the worst time. Like in May that year, Aidan Kelly was 19 from Moyross. He was shot dead near his home, and that was believed to be related to a feud. Then you have in September 17, Fat Frankie Ryan was shot dead as he sat in a car. He was shot in the back of the head by somebody sitting in the back seat. And Gary Campion, as we know, then is later convicted of that. And it was seen as a real callous kind of murder.
He's convicted of the Fat Frankie Ryan shooting.
Yes.
He's sitting in the back of the car. He's also our getaway driver in the Brian Fitzgerald
Yeah, he's
murder.
serving 2 life sentences. He's serving life for both those murders. But this was kind of seen again. The Fat Frankie murder was considered pretty cold and ruthless because he was part and parcel of the McCarthy Dundons, and he was killed by his own.
The double cross.
Yeah, and they double crossed him for whatever reason. And then you had, I suppose, Anthony Kelly then in October that year then is charged with the Brian Fitzgerald murder. So again, it looks like the guards are finally getting not getting to grips, but it's finally working. Their hard work is paying off.
And is Anthony Kelly named by James Martin Cahill as one of them?
He's one of these people. James Martin Cahill is going to be the star witness in this future trial of Kelly Kilrush and 2 of the Dundon brothers who he alleges that were part and parcel of this, along with Gary Campion.
Yeah.
And like we get, because he's charged with the murder, we get to learn a little bit more about Kelly at this stage. Like there's a bail hearing, and he was actually described as being one of the biggest importers of drugs into this jurisdiction. So all of a sudden, somebody who was in the shadows is now seen as, he must be one of these kind of shadowy figures, the major players who's directing or part of the McCarthy Dundons. And he looks to be one of these guys who is at the top end of international, transnational criminality. And it's the first time we kind of get any kind of idea of this. But in the meantime, there's another 2 murders that year. There's a heroin addict, Thomas Moran, 26-year-old, shot dead in South Hill. Probably not connected with the feud, believed to be a local drugs gang, but it's the
effects of this is kind of like filtering down to the sort of the younger, the smaller groups, like that whole culture of you kill.
Yeah. Yeah.
There's no negotiation.
No.
It's a bullet.
And it's careless. As we know, then the next murder in the following month, Noel Crawford is shot dead in South Hill. They were after his brother. Like it was a mistake. They were after Paul Crawford. And Jonathan Fitzgerald is convicted after trial and sentenced to life for that.
And Jonathan Fitzgerald is 21 years of age, so he's sentenced to life after that around 2006. Do we know anything about him, or is he just one of these soldiers plucked from the... He's
quite the record as far as I remember. And there's not a close relation of his had quite the record and been involved in attempted murders himself. Again, you're looking at he's 21, but
I'm looking at how young he is. Yeah,
but I mean, Gary Campion was 25 when he was convicted for one of the murders. So I mean, he was younger than that when he carried them out. I mean, you're talking about very young men. Frankie Wine was 21 when he was shot dead. So you have a lot of people who are very they're young, but they're ruthless. They have probably, unfortunately have kind of some hard experience already under their belt at that stage.
The violence has become a culture, hasn't it?
It has, yeah. I know this is like when people from nice leafy suburbs like ourselves, hopefully, our kids are when they hit 23, 24, 25, or maybe a year or 2 out of college and starting in their careers, whereas these guys are now involved in murders and gangland murders.
And standing to face life sentences in prison. By 2007, Noel Campion, who's Gary Campion's older brother, and did he not carry out one of those horrendous robberies on a pensioner?
Yeah.
Is he involved in?
Yeah, there is.
Skiing?
Potty skiing. That was that one. Yeah, it was kind of one of these aggravated burglaries where they're searching for the cash and it was ransacked. And
the poor man didn't he have a sort of a haberdashery store, a clothing store or something? And he was living on his own, and they broke in and they tied him.
Yes, they basically left him to die
by the ankles, and
it was one of those again horrific murders.
Horrendous, yeah. So he's shot dead, Noel Campion. So who has it out for him?
That was. I remember that murder that he was walking along. Anyone who's say walking from the city centre going out to the rugby ground will walk this route, and it was He was shot. I'm not sure was he on his motorbike, but there was another motorcyclist basically trapped him and shot him. And to be honest, I'm not sure. Which,
yes, he has any amount of enemies.
But like Gary Campion, they were feared. So and again, there's always the possibility that he had carried out other activities for either gang, and it's quite possible that somebody wanted to make sure he wasn't going to do a deal or ever talk, and so he was shot dead, or else it was simple revenge as well.
And by the October, another 25-year-old Gareth Grant. I mean, I don't even remember the name Gareth.
It's terrible,
Grant.
isn't it?
Terrible, yeah.
It is, yeah.
He's killed in St. Mary's Park, and later a Keane Colopy gang member called Greg Corford is convicted after trial and given a life sentence. So that's a kind of a Keane Colopy killing on somebody who is seen as being linked with the Dundons, or
It would have been. And then, adding to this kind of sense of the gangs being in control again, then you had another reasonably high profile case involving perjury and Eric Leamy that again come to court, which again shows kind of, I suppose, the inability of I suppose the criminal justice systems to make some of the charges stick. Like it was becoming too hard. You're kind of wondering, well, this definitely would be a case that would be before the special criminal court now. And then, the teenager Richard Kelly, Happy Kelly, his body was found in November. So that case kind of shows you the savage ruthlessness of
17
you're dealing with.
What was the story with Richard Kelly, Happy Kelly?
The story was that he took a car for a joyride, and that there was drugs or something or guns or whatever, but possibly in the car. But whatever car he took, he fell foul of one of these serious players, and they basically killed him. And they threw his body in a lake, and it was. I think there was. It was found. I'm not sure if it was an intelligence-led search or how his body was recovered, but his body was found. But 2 years after he went missing,
did his family campaign for help or appeal in that?
They did, and his mother has been involved over the years then in kind of a lot of community work in the South Hill area. So it's kind of, I suppose it's hardly call it a silver lining, but it just shows you that, we're here talking about Limerick and all the gangland stuff and the horrible stuff that's happened, but there's a lot of very good people who do a lot of very good work and
have had such tragedy in their life, like a 17-year-old child being abducted.
Yeah, it's horrendous.
Yeah.
So in November, that was in November, and around the same time, you would have had James Cahill's in the witness box. So he's the star witness against Anthony Kelly and Desi and John Dundon. And I remember being at that, and it was in Clover Hill where they had this one. And I just remember looking at the back of his head. It was as he was given, he was just talking, he wasn't even answering questions.
Right.
And Campion was there. And Kelly Kilrush was there in a blazer and tie, and the Dundons were there in their tracksuits. They were in custody at the time, and it was almost impossible to take notes. I remember, he was just talking gibberish, and he was talking about the voices in his head would come to him, and they come out of the television, and it was only when he told the truth that these voices would stop, and that basically these guys had nothing to do with the murder. And it was only an eyewitness account that actually pinned it on Gary Campion. It was a separate witness.
So the voices in his head, he's talking about, he's changing his tune.
Oh yeah, totally. And starts. He starts admitting or claiming that he had carried out horrific sexual assaults and really bizarre stuff. Now, I remember there were stories about him in the prison at the time, and that he was so paranoid about his food, and I was getting stories about him being, this guy is completely off his rocker, So in one sense, I wasn't surprised, but was it an act or not? I don't know. But the upshot was the two Dundons beat that murder charge, and so did Kelly of Kilrush. And
they all walked free. Now, the point about James Martin Cahill was he on witness protection? He was put on the programme within the prison because he was giving evidence against these guys?
Well, he was certainly a protected prisoner. He was at one point on a landing completely by himself, and all the lights in all the cells on that landing were put on at night. So people from the outside couldn't tell which one he was in case this plot to use a rocket to kill
launcher,
him,
which go through the walls.
It was genuinely considered.
Yes.
And at one point he was only eating bags of crisps because it was the only food that was sealed.
So he's probably is paranoid, right? I mean, there's no question of that. Yeah. But whether or not, the fear of these guys, that final step of giving the evidence to put them away, overwhelms him. It's difficult because, to dance with this witness protection stuff, the state has to kind of get into bed with criminals and with people who are, by and large, probably untrustworthy. And it takes a long time for a court case to come to court. So you're kind of trying to keep them on the straight and narrow for a long time. And then you get a situation like this. I'm sure everybody who was involved in it was just shaking their heads. They knew these guys were going to walk.
And don't forget, they already thought they had their star witness in Philip Dean in the same case. And that went
lost him because of the intimidation and the threats. I presume they were quite happy, Desi and John Dundon and the others.
Well, they beat one rap, yeah.
Yeah.
And Kerry of Kilrush is still out and about.
Yeah.
A free man. And
obviously Brian Fitzgerald's family had to watch all that happen, which must have been really difficult for them.
Yeah, his wife did give evidence in the case, and it was very courageous of her, and she didn't hold back, in terms of what she saw and recounting, the horror of it as well.
I'm Nicola Tallant, and you're watching Crime World, a podcast about criminals, drugs, and the underworld in Ireland and across the globe. Make sure you subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you can be the first to watch all our latest episodes. You can also listen wherever you get your podcasts.